Hello, we're here today with Dr. Bob Milligan, Senior Consultant for Dairy Strategies, LLC. Today, he will outline the three types of feedback.
Thank you, Karen. One of the most important things to understand is that we in agriculture are typically very well trained to manage cows, to manage crops. The challenge is that when we're talking about people, we really aren't talking about management. We're talking about leading and coaching people. One of the greatest tools for that is feedback. We'll start with positive feedback. Positive feedback is actually a tremendous challenge for managers because we aren't used to it. When we deal with cows and crops, we're looking for problems, and we're fantastic at identifying them and fixing them and moving forward. With people, we obviously need to do that, but we also need to provide that coaching, that positive feedback, the encouragement, the recognition for achievement. And that seems uncomfortable and unfamiliar to us. One of the reasons it's so uncomfortable to us, I think, will come out if you take a look at this question. How many times have you provided positive feedback in the last 24 hours? When I ask this question to a large group, I typically get 2 or 3 people who answer D. When I ask them the circumstance of their giving 5 or more positive feedbacks, most of the time they indicate that they were doing something with children, teaching Sunday school, coaching sports, something of that nature. So why is it that we're more comfortable giving positive feedback to children than we are to adults? The reason is not that adults don't want positive feedback. It's that they aren't very good at receiving it. They've quote unquote learned that you shouldn't be bubbly when you get positive feedback. So it's important to understand that even though you may not get a warm fuzzy back when you give positive feedback, 99.9% of us human beings do actually want positive feedback. So what do we do to coach giving positive feedback? You need to catch your employees doing something right. We're really good at catching them doing something wrong. We have to focus on catching them doing something right. Now, Don Shula, in a book written with Ken Blanchard, says good performance should always be treated differently than poor performance. Now that sounds pretty obvious, but as supervisors and coaches, we don't really do a very good job of that, and it's really important that we do that. So let's think more about feedback. We just talked about giving positive feedback for good performance. Now, what do we do when performance or behavior is not up to snuff? It's unacceptable. Well, our typical thinking is that we give negative feedback, and we think of negative feedback as a reprimand. I want you to eliminate that thinking from your mind. There actually are 3 types of feedback. And the reason for that is that with unacceptable performance, there are 2 different situations. The first one is meeting the expectation, in other words, having good performance, was under the control of the employee. They had all the resources, the training, everything they needed to meet the performance standard, but they did not. They didn't put in enough energy, enough motivation, enough commitment. In this case, a negative feedback is appropriate. But there's this green area, and this actually is very common. The performance was not what we wanted it to be, but the reason for that was out of the control of the employee. What do we do in this situation? I think most managers really understand intuitively what we're talking about, because positive feedback isn't appropriate here. Negative feedback here isn't appropriate because it would be unfair. So what most managers do is nothing. What they should do is provide a redirection feedback. Step in and redirect to success. Provide the additional training, provide the additional resources, readjust the expectation, whatever it takes to have good performance. Redirection feedback is probably the greatest tool for any supervisor and coach. How common is redirection feedback needed? I think it's most of the time when there's unacceptable performance. I actually was speaking at a program, and there was a well-known dairy farm manager who was also on the program. And one of the comments he made was 90% of the time when I analyze one of my employees' mistakes, I conclude that the problem was something that I did. In other words, he's saying I should have given redirection feedback. I don't know whether it's 90 or 80 or 70, but I'm pretty darn sure it's more than half. So this table summarizes what we should do with inadequate performance. We should always, or almost always at least, start with redirection feedback. Assume that the situation or the context, not the employee, was the problem. Very few employees perform poorly on purpose. They need some training, they need some clarity, they need some encouragement, they need realistic expectations. If and only when we conclude that all of those were provided and that the cause of poor performance was the employee's motivation, effort, commitment, focus, then and only then is a negative feedback, a warning, or a reprimand with consequences if the poor performance continues. Only then is that appropriate. Do employees understand this? I think they absolutely do. They can't say they want redirection feedback, but they know when they've been treated unfairly. I was interviewing with one of my clients, and one of my common questions when I do interviews is, give me 2 or 3 characteristics that you look for in a supervisor. This one candidate, I didn't even have the question out of my mouth when he said, I want a boss who doesn't blame me when it's not my fault. In our terminology, I want a boss who doesn't give me negative feedback when it should have been redirection. Employees know the difference. And I think this table is really much better at characterizing the actual usage that we should have. If we do a good job with redirection feedback and positive feedback and the other coaching tools, we really aren't going to need to use a lot of negative feedback. So remember, the number one takeaway from this podcast is there are 3 types of feedback, not 2, and that redirection feedback is one of the most powerful tools of a supervisor.
Thank you, Bob. For more information on employee management, view additional podcasts at www.progressivedairy.com.